I went to art school. The plan was to be an artist. I fell in love with just making art, specifically comic books, and I kind of found my way into design sort of sideways. I ended up learning design in school. I got my first job at the Boston Phoenix, as a matter of fact. And so from there, I started kind of teaching myself a little bit of web development, and web development kind of went back into UX, and fell in love with creating products that people could interact with. And so since then, I've left. I went from the Phoenix. I went kind of in the tech startup world, worked for a fantastic startup called Aware, acquired by PayPal. I'll spare you the resume. But I ended up leaving to start an organization called Resilient Coders. So at Resilient Coders, we work with young people who might not necessarily be connected or have access to the tech economy. We train them up in web development skills such that they can be impossible to ignore. And then we have an agency that employs the students that graduate from our program. And so they build and design websites for paying clients like Friends of Fort Point. We believe in economic opportunity, and we think that web design and development in this town is the way to do that. So you guys are here not to talk about me and my life, but to talk about UX. What is UX? Bang. It's not how it looks, it's how it works. It's the whole experience of using the product. Right, so the example that I always give folks is that you can design a gorgeous website, and if it takes 10 seconds to load, that's a horrible user experience. The UI is just obviously the user interface. If you're talking about software, UI and UX are sometimes used a little bit interchangeably, even though they're not really the same thing. And then visual design is just making it look nice. I believe UX is like jazz. It's all about setting up structure and then surprising. Right, so with your jazz or with your hip hop, whatever, you're going to have your drum and your bass, and that's going to be kind of predictable. It's going to set up a sort of convention over which you want to float a melody. And there is only one melody, but that melody is supported by all other elements on the page. I like to think of it as this. It's the art of setting up and deviating from expectations with purpose. I believe that UX is a system of mirrors. Much like art, and I think that UX and art operate in a very similar way in that it's a system of mirrors reflecting the culture that you're trying to interact with. And I think it's about empathy. So it's about connecting with the user, and if you don't understand the user, you're not really going to create a fantastic user experience. So one of the big deviations that I encountered in my personal journey from making art to making design is the question of who is at the center of the piece of work. Right? So when you're talking about art, art can be, and maybe on some level, maybe should be, somewhat autobiographical. Right? And UX is not that at all. UX is about what is perceived. I believe also in flow, the flow of UX. So it should flow in a way that makes sense. You want to have a sense for what the user is, what their expectations are, what their behavior is at the moment when they use the product. And then you want to grab the user by the hand and kind of walk them down the experience of using the product. So like a key takeaway that I always throw out there to potential clients is you don't want to have more than one call to action per user persona if you can help it. Because then that person is going to have a couple of options, and you might lose some folks, and that's where you get drop-off. But if you have a really solid understanding of who your user is, then you might put together a solid understanding of what you want that user to be able to do, and you can create a flow. Besides flow of using the product, there's also a certain workflow. But this is something that I throw out there that we do at Resilient Coders when we work with new clients. You want to start with a kickoff, go from kickoff, and kickoff is when you kind of get a sense for what the client really wants to do. And then from there we go into the discovery phase, which is not just what the particular client wants to do, but also we do a competitive landscape audit. So what that means is that we make sure that we have an understanding of organizations that are out there that do something similar or competitive to what the client does. And that just serves the purpose of giving us a little bit of a benchmark. And then we do the visual design, but then what's really important for the wireframing phase, even before the visual design stuff, is just iterating. And this, again, is where I think this has a lot of touch point with my days of making art. Because you just have a simple theme or a concept, and you want to just be able to iterate on it. Do it again, but better. Learning from whatever you learned from the last time you did it, pivoting accordingly. So I call this the build, measure, pivot loop. Something called lean. So in lean design principles, you're basically just creating in very small batches. So you build what you think, what your assumptions are based on, right? And then you measure to see how well that works, and then you pivot accordingly. So some of you guys might be like art school me, and you're like, you can't measure art, man. Yes, you can, and you must. This was another divergence for me between art and user experience, because when I first started out, I'm thinking, I'm just going to make this beautiful piece of design. It's going to be just totally brand new. And you know what? If you don't get it, like, whatever. I don't care. But the fact of the matter is that that's not going to make for a very good user experience designer, because it just doesn't make for a very good user experience. So I've put together a comprehensive list of all the things that will kill your user experience. Honestly, that's about it. When like user experience doesn't work, it's just because you haven't been successful in getting into the head of your particular user base. So I've gone ahead and spent a decade or so making all kinds of mistakes for you guys, so that I could come here and tell you about these mistakes so that you don't have to make them. The mistakes that I have made as a designer are, I think, largely due to the fact that I have a background in fine arts, right? So for example, getting started with high fidelity mock-ups before wireframes are approved, just because I'm really excited about the product and I just want to get out there and design it. But the fact of the matter is that if the wireframe is not yet approved, you can deliver a high fidelity mock-up and the client's going to say, okay, cool, but I kind of want this section to be over here, and I don't think we need this paragraph on here, so really you got to create a separate page. And then honestly, as a designer, you got to eat it, and you got to go back and make those changes, and it's kind of your fault that you worked off of something that wasn't yet approved. And the other thing is that I have designed for myself and not for the user. I would be doing everybody a huge disservice if we didn't talk about mobile first. So for those of you who are not quite familiar with mobile first, it is basically the philosophy that you should design for mobile first, right? And then go to desktop. If you're curious about this, you want to read more about it, there's a very small book that I promise you can read very quickly by Luke Roblewski. But mobile first is about content, but it's also about design. And it comes down to the question of just simplification. So whenever you finish any kind of a design, the first thing you want to find out, you want to ask yourself is there a way to simplify this further? Can I use fewer colors and make this still work? Can I use fewer typefaces and make this still work? And some people ask, well, isn't this going to make my website boring? And that's when I tell them about the law of the three-legged stool. The fact of the matter is you don't need more than 3 legs to make the stool functional. If the stool is wobbly, one thing you could do is you can grab another piece of wood and you can nail it on, right? And then you've got a 4-legged stool and maybe it's going to be more stable. But the better thing to do than that is figure out which leg of the stool is weak and fix it, right? So I take a similar approach with design. If you have very few typefaces, if you have very little bit of color, and the design isn't quite working, the solution is not more, it's better. So I believe heartily in burning it down. Right, so build it up, try it out, see if it works, measure it, burn it down. I had a teacher once that said, sometimes you just got to kill your darling. It's a little brutal, but it makes a lot of sense because as an artist, right, you kind of fall in love with your own work. And sometimes, I think this is true for both art and design, you got to kill it off, burn it down, and start again. Another core thing that I learned transitioning from design into development was being able to talk about design. Because I think one of the most important tools for a designer to have is being able to speak in a way that is intelligible to clients. And so the first step, by the way, in being able to articulate your design decisions is to have design decisions, right? Don't decorate, design. Because when you decorate, your client's going to call you out and say, so why do you have the weird curlicue over here in the top right? And you're like, I like it. But I'll tell you that the second that either of you uses the word like, you have lost as a designer and as a client, right? As soon as a conversation becomes subjective, you have failed. What you want to do is you want to be able to reference stuff that you talked about during the discovery phase and your competitive landscape audit. So I wanted to breeze through that stuff. I do want to also give you hard and fast actual tools that you can use if you are one of those folks who is thinking about making the transition from working in art to making in design. There's one thing that you can use, I don't know if you've thought about this, but you can use actual paper and pencil. And then there's an app, of course, called Prototyping on Paper, ironically. Right, so with prototyping on paper, you actually draw the application. This is for mobile. So if you're designing a mobile product, you might draw your application, and then you can kind of create hotspots. Right, so you snap a couple photos of the different screens onto prototyping on paper, and then you can create hotspots. and then you can use those hotspots to link to other pages. It's like a super dead simple way to make a prototype based on your drawings in like 15 minutes. We use wireframe.cc at Resilient Coders. So if you are getting started with wireframe, by the way, do people know what wireframing is? I'm sorry, I like totally glossed over that. Cool. So just to say it in like a sentence, it's basically, if you can think of like, if you're sitting down with a friend and you're like, well, here's what I want to draw, and then you kind of draw your website on a napkin, right? So that gives you a general sense for layout. It's going to be line and shape, no color, no design, and it's going to give you a sense for your hierarchy of content. So wireframing is super important to do with clients early on before you start high fidelity mocks, because that's where your client has an opportunity to say, oh, wait a second, we actually don't need that intro paragraph there. Or wait, this is actually a separate page. And you're like, okay, cool, separate page, like, Command N. And so wireframing is super important for that. Wireframing is also critical because of the fact that making a change to the product during wireframing is like a 15-minute fix. Making a change to your product when you're designing is a much bigger fix. Making a change to your product while you're developing, pack up and go home. So that's why wireframing is really key. I'm a big fan of GIMP, which is a free and open source software version of Photoshop. I know it's for Linux. I don't know if there's also a Microsoft version, but you should check it out. Pixlr is like a very simple photo editing software that you can use online. And for the type nerds, do we have any type nerds? Bang, Lost Type. There's a lot of great typography on there. It is pay what you want. I wanted to keep this kind of short because I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, comments, insults, ideas, thoughts. With trendy stuff that kind of pops up, it's like super hot for like a minute. And then you got to redo your site because you don't want to look 2014, God forbid, right? So my personal like art website is the simplest. It's literally just like the artwork, full width, and then you scroll and there's more artwork. Then you scroll and there's more artwork. That's it. It's super simple because for me, the purpose of my artistic website is just to show the artwork. Yeah, so I think it all depends on who you want to impress with your site. So I have this conversation a lot with artist designer hybrids because they have these websites that are like, here's a website that I designed, and here's this like super abstract photo that I took of rain. You know what I mean? And you're like, that's cool, they're both awesome, but like, who are you talking to? Right? If you want to showcase your work, then showcase the work, that's great. But if you want to get a job as a designer, then you want to have a website that's just designed. And the reason for that is because we are simple mammals, right? And so when a hiring manager gets one website that has some web design on it, and then like black and white pictures of rain, versus another website that's just like website, 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 we as simple mammals mistake that for specialization and mistake specialization for expertise. And so people end up going for the option that's just the designer. And so for folks who are kind of both, I recommend that people bifurcate right at the entrance. So the short answer is no. The short answer is a good designer is invisible. And by that I mean that if I were a better designer back when I had this like lingerie client, then my personal style should not have come up at all. And I should just have, I should have like been one with the client, been one with their user, and just designed something that went along with what their expectations were. And so a good designer is invisible. Now, you can also do design for the sake of artwork, and I think that's awesome. When I was at the Phoenix, I had on my cubicle, I don't know if you remember this, but I had on my cubicle a bunch of designs that were rejected. I call them the Delmar rejection collection. And at a certain point, to me, there was value in just being like, you know what, I made this for me. But that's not necessarily going to translate well into a successful user experience. I take it as a data point. Part of my transformation, right, from artist to designer, and then like to developer and like, business owner, right? I've had to like force myself to test and be disciplined about the testing. And the fact of the matter is that testing is always going to be different based on what it is that you're testing for. I have built what's called a bullseye framework. Has anyone ever heard of bullseye framework? So there's a book, if you're interested in testing, there's a book, it's focused on marketing, but I think that it applies to design as well, and it's called Traction. It's by Gabriel Weinberg. And he basically, he rolls out this program, this framework that he calls the Bullseye Framework. And it's basically like, channel that you want to test, what are the KPIs, the key performance indicators, and then how did it perform, right? So an example of this is, we recently had one of our hackathons from which we recruit students at Resilient Coders. And we're trying out a couple different things. One is we rolled out a $100 alumni referral bonus program. And then we spent money on Facebook ads. And then we also sent emails to to partners of ours. And what I did is I have a legit spreadsheet that says how many people came in from each channel. And then you can measure which channel is just objectively better than others. 50% of the people who came to our hackathon came from alumni referrals. And 0% came from Facebook. Right? So never again will I use Facebook for that particular purpose. And I think you can do the same thing with design. You just have to think strategically about how you do it. If you're talking about digital product, like if you're talking about Google AdWords or email, those things, there are companies that are built around measuring the success of those different products. So Google AdWords will just tell you how many people clicked on what different campaign, and you can A/B test within a campaign. And you should be A/B testing email as well. So when you do email, you can do all right, here's the marketing department's email where it has the buy now sticker, and then here's the design, here's the super hipster designer version where it's just a looping video of a guy smoking a cigarette, and which one of those two is going to perform better? That's a really good question, and I think the honest answer is that it totally depends on your industry. If you're working in technology, the fact of the matter is that your product should always be evolving, always. I'm sure that there are other industries out there that I'm not familiar with. If you build airplanes, your product should last, right? I think that there are things here and there that are going to have more of a shelf life than others. So I once sat down, when I was at PayPal, I found myself at dinner next to the head of global brand for PayPal. And this topic came up. Does anybody remember the huge PayPal rebrand of 3 years ago? Really? We got a couple of yeses? So I'm surprised because I didn't even notice, and I worked for PayPal on the design team. So I got an advance. It's here's the logo, but don't show anybody. It's super secret. And I open it up and I'm like, really? I'm I guess you got rid of the line. Right, so I, as a big branding nerd, I was oh, this would have been such an opportunity to totally do a different, completely different direction. And so I found myself at dinner sitting next to the head of global brand, and I can't help myself. And I asked him about this logo. And I was kind of so what's up with the logo? And he takes out a napkin and he draws for me this graph, which I have since named after him, the Alan Olivo graph. This is just my term. Don't try to Google it. And on one side of the graph, he has safe, conventional, predictable. And on the other side, he has trendy, new thing. And he's you live over here, right? You're Mr. Tech startup design guy, and so you want everything to be the new Airbnb logo where it's a paperclip, right? But not all of us are over there, right? Who is over here in safe, comfortable, and predictable? Banks. Things that you don't want to disappear overnight, right? So banks, law firms, actually a lot of political artwork. There's a lot of stuff that kind of sits over here on the safe and predictable side because of the fact that it's comforting. This might be gone tomorrow. The fact of the matter is that all companies are somewhere along the line of that gamut, and you need to find where your company is. And the point that he was making to me is that, yes, we're a tech company, but we're also a bank. And so we want to make it clear that we're kind of somewhere in the middle, and we don't want to scare people off. We're going to be yes, this is still the same company it was in 1999. Yes, your money is safe. And I would say the same thing about all companies. So sometimes when we find ourselves in a kickoff meeting and there's a lot of disagreement within within the client side, clients within themselves aren't agreeing on certain things, what we do is we do this graph and we say, well, where are you on this graph? And more often than not, there's disagreement about where they are on the gamut. Does that kind of make sense? Because people are you always have the designer who's yeah, no, we got to make it green and yellow and brick slab. And then you have like the someone else who's like, but that's kind of weird. That's super hipster. It's going to be super lame in 6 months. It honestly depends on your user and what it is that you want to convey. Absolutely, because it comes down to what they need their website to look like and do. Sometimes we have like, so once upon a time I designed like one of those parallax scrolling sites. Right, yeah, and so it was like, this was like 2010, right? So everybody was doing it. Come on, man, everyone's doing it. I jumped on the bandwagon. I loved it, but it's like, it's very much 2010. And I've had clients who like have seen that work, and they're like, I want that. And I'm like, no, please, you don't. You really don't. Because it's cool, but it's also like 2010. And also, it's a horrible user experience because it's JavaScript and it takes forever to load, blah, blah, blah. And what ends up happening is we have this conversation of like, what is it that you want to convey? And sometimes people are like, no, I want to do the super trendy new thing. And I'm like, okay, but that means that you're redesigning in a year. Because if you're doing something that's super trendy, it's going to be super lame in a year.